we are at a standstill. And I think most importantly, from a market reaction, is what this does is inject greater uncertainty. And we've been there before many times with Mr. Trump just in the last several months about how his policies, he tends to cry wolf.
The markets have been responding today to the decision of a trade court in the US blocking Donald Trump from imposing sweeping global tariffs on imports. This was, as we know, a key policy for the president. He's got a plank economic policy, right? Unveiled as Liberation Day on April the 2nd. But now a 3-judge panel has concluded that the US president exceeded his authority when he unveiled additional taxes on foreign-made goods. Tariffs must typically be approved by Congress, of course, but Trump has argued that he had the power to act because it was a, quote, national emergency. Here is White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt giving it both guns in the last hour.
3 judges of the U.S. Court of International Trade brazenly abused their judicial power to usurp the authority of President Trump to stop him from carrying out the mandate that the American people gave him. These judges failed to acknowledge that the President of the United States has core foreign affairs powers and authority given to him by Congress to protect the United States economy and national security. Congress had created the National Emergency Act to provide the congressional framework to strike down improper IEEPA use. And any questions over whether President Trump improperly imposed these IEEPA tariffs were already adjudicated in Congress following Liberation Day.
Okay, well, let's get the thoughts now of Harry Broadman, former US Assistant Trade Representative, as well as Chief of Staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisers under George H.W. Bush, and Bill Clinton. Hi there, Harry.
Hi there, how are you?
Good, thank you. Thanks for making the time for us today.
Sure.
So talk us through what you think might happen next then. The White House are obviously appealing the decision, as we very much heard Caroline Leavitt say there. If it goes to the Supreme Court, what do you think would happen next?
Well, that's what I think everyone is believing is going to be the ultimate step. Obviously, some of those appointees are people that Mr. Trump put on the court, and you can look at recent rulings, and they have tended, at least on non-trade issues, to support what the President Trump has argued for. Whether that will happen in this case, I think, is going to be much more complicated because the stakeholders are quite, influential and powerful, namely the firms, labor unions, and the like, and the general public.
I don't know how you feel about this, Harry, but I can't decide whether this was a surprise or not. I sort of woke up this morning and heard the headline. It was like, wow, like I say, that is Trump's big economic policy, the tariffs. But on the other hand, using historic emergency powers to hand out trade tariffs by presidential decree, that always seemed a bit vulnerable to this kind of action.
It is. And I understand why you and many others are surprised and why that makes a market reaction and a social reaction, because everyone is so fixated on tariffs and trade, obviously, at this point in time. But these kinds of rulings are not unusual. So I think we should, be a little bit more subdued about what's going on. He will obviously appeal this matter. It will go through another court and then ultimately perhaps to the Supreme Court. It's a well-known law that the Trump administration used as the basis for his tariffs. I think some of the people who advised him to use the basis of this law probably are now questioning whether that was the right basis or not. But it's the one that many of us who are trade aficionados thought it would be used.
And so actually it might just be a case of finding another law to use to achieve the same ends.
Well, yeah, that will, well, so there are 2 routes. One is appealing the decision, which we know is part of Mr. Trump's DNA. He appeals anything and sues for anything. And whether or not they try to appeal the tariffs based on other laws, which there are other laws, as you note, becomes a little bit more dicey because the justification on those laws are less broad than under the so-called IEEPA, the International Emergency Trade Protection Act. So, I think we are at a standstill, and I think most importantly, from a market reaction, is what this does is inject greater uncertainty. And we've been there before many times with Mr. Trump just in the last several months about how his policies he tends to cry wolf, is what I'm calling what his trade policy is. He puts tariffs on the table, then he withdraws them, or in this particular case, a court rules against him.
Well, and also, there's just so much going on, ever since he returned to power. And I suppose this is by design. You sort of can't focus, can you, on what they're doing because they're doing so many things. But it is that almost kind of Silicon Valley move fast and break things philosophy where actually, like I say, maybe it isn't a surprise that something has got broken.
Well, I think those who are around Trump thought that there was some risk of this happening, particularly given who the appointees of that court are. But they believe strongly, obviously, almost as a theological matter, that this is the right basis on which Trump wanted and should act. Obviously, their judgment now is being questioned. But as I say, I think the most important thing is he's going to drive the train to put on tariffs one way or another, whether he wins in various court suits or not. Obviously, we'll soon know. But the main issue, I think, here is this just engenders greater uncertainty about what U.S. international economic policy is. And that is, frankly, more corrosive than if we knew, okay, so now there's going to be 10% tariffs on these goods from these countries and 15 on these countries, and that's the way it will be. People can adjust. It's not going to, I think, result in the kinds of nirvana that Trump hopes for, but at least there's certainty. And we're back, once again, I don't think we've ever left, into this uncertain world of Donald Trump and trade policy.
Yeah, well, that's, I suppose, why it's difficult, to borrow your word, to be subdued about this for countries that are under threat by massive whacked-up tariffs and who are actually mid-negotiation with the United States at the moment. I mean, as a sort of tariff expert, what would you recommend to them? They'll be thinking, do we need to offer any concessions to Trump at all if a judge is about to strike our deal anyway?
Absolutely. I mean, that is the human instinct, and you can be sure that the lawyers in these various countries, the businesses in those countries who are directly affected rather than the governments, are also trying to figure out what other paths may be chosen by Trump. And as I say, so it's not only is there the economic and market uncertainty, but there's going to be a lot of legal fees paid by well-known and highly trusted, qualified lawyers to try to figure out, well, no, he can't use this law, he can't use this law. And then there'll be lawyers on the other side saying, well, yeah. And as you say, we're in the midst of, and we don't really know how many countries are in the middle of active negotiations. What one reads in the press, frankly, is not aligned with what I think the reality is. I don't know what the actual number of countries is because all I know is what I hear and what I read in the press. But as I say, this is not a helpful sign for the U.S. economy and, most importantly, U.S. economic leadership around the world.
Indeed. Harry Broadman, a former US Assistant Trade Representative, as well as Chief of Staff of the President's Council of Economic Advisers under George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton. Thanks for that.